All right, welcome everybody. Welcome all our Torah Anytime viewers, listeners, subscribers. We are beginning today, B'ezrat Hashem, the story of Rabbi Akiva. It's going to be probably a mini-series, three-series class, hopefully. Amazing, fascinating life story. We're going to try to go from everything from A to Z. There's actually a wealth of information on him in the Midrashim, in the Gemara, and in other sources as well. There brings a lot about his life. He is one of the reasons why this is so fascinating. One of the reasons why, first of all, we're doing it specifically now is the Omel. The Omel, we know Rabbi Akiva had 24,000 students that died during this time. One of the reasons that we have this mourning process. We don't shave, we don't take haircuts, we don't listen to music, we don't get married during these times. So it pays to understand not only his students, which we don't have that much information about that whole situation, but their master, their teacher, and what a tremendous level that he was able to reach. The reason why this story is so fascinating and it comes to interest in so many people is because that it has, generally you have somebody who became the biggest rabbi in Israel. So how does that person become biggest rabbi? You hear about him when he's 4 years old, he already learned and taught himself how to read. When he's already 7 years old, he already memorized the entire Mishnah. By 10 years old, he already finished the Gemara, and by 15 already he made a Siyum Hashas and Siyum Talmud Yerushalmi, Talmud Bavli, all the Halakha, everything he's done. So then you go and you're like, okay, listen, you're 20, 30, 40 years old already, and you'll be like, oh, how could I ever reach a commit to someone that on his caliber? Rabbi Akiva was not like that. Rabbi Akiva was somebody who came in from very, very humble origins. Besides the fact that he was a convert, he comes from a lineage of converts. Some say his father or his grandfather was converted to Judaism. So he didn't have the lineage. He didn't have his big rabbi father helped and taught him Torah from when he's a little baby until he became what he was. He also came from a poor background. He was a shepherd. He didn't have any family money. Not only was he a shepherd, he was a shepherd that he had to rent himself out to somebody else. He wasn't even a shepherd for his own sheep. Additionally, he did not start learning Torah until the age of 40. Until the age of 40, he did not even know the Aleph Bet. He did not know how to read. He was illiterate. He was also, besides to top it off all on that, he had a strong hatred towards rabbis. He would say about himself, he says, if I would see a rabbi, I would like to bite him like a donkey. He wanted to bite him so hard, so they ask, why not a dog? Why specifically a donkey? Because a donkey's bite is so hard, it pulverizes the bone. So that's how much he hated rabbis. Yet, there's one more actually. He was actually a single father at the age of 40 already. And he was widowed, from his first, possibly widowed from his first marriage, had a little child. And he comes in to the scene at 40 years old, an illiterate shepherd, not only not knowing any Torah, hating the rabbis, hating and trying to go away from all that, and yet he became one of the greatest sages of all time. The level that it says about him is so unbelievable. The Gemara speaks about it. The Gemara says that he is referred to, Rabbi Akiva is referred to as Rosh LaChachamim, the head of all the sages. He's considered that, and I'll tell you even more so. There's a interesting, I believe it's a midrash that brings it down that there was Moshe Rabbeinu asked God, why is there little, when you see a Sefer Torah, there's something called the crowns on the Sefer Torah, which is like little lines that go on top of the letters. So he says, why do we need the little crowns? So HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God tells Moshe, says there's going to be a time where there's going to be a person by the name of Akiva ben Yosef, and he's going to go and he's going to be able to darshan, he's going to be able to teach about just from those crowns. So Moshe goes over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and says, listen, if you have a guy like a Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef, why am I giving the Torah? That's the level that he was considered, such a high caliber level that highest of the sages quoted one of the most in the Gemara, in the Mishnah. So you see somebody who comes from nothing to so much. It really pays to learn to try to understand this story. And there's so many amazing lessons that you could hear from this story, both from the woman's side and from the men's side. The woman's side on the sacrifices that his wife makes, and also from his side, from his perseverance and his ability to discern all these little nuances in the Torah, and which led him to become one of the greatest people in the history of the Jewish nation. So, with that introduction, let us begin. Before we begin, when we're going to go through this story, we're not going to just go through the story with just based on his life. I'm trying to give you a picture of the whole scenario. What was going on during the time of the time when Rabbi Akiva was alive. Also, try to give a little bit of information of his rabbis, and hopefully maybe we'll see if we're able to get also on the students as well. So, Rabbi Akiva lived through a very, very harsh period in Jewish history. He lived through the destruction of the Second Temple. So during the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, while there was a siege, there was a siege by Vespasian. He was a general, and he put a siege around Yerushalayim. And during that time, there was a big rabbi. The biggest rabbi in time was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai came, and he snuck himself out to meet with Vespasian, with this general, to try to come to some sort of deal that at least save something with the Jewish nation, because it was only a matter of time before he was going to take it over. So how did he get out there? He had to sneak out of there. So what he did is that he pretended to be dead, pretended to die. He put himself in a coffin. They even put dead animal carcasses in the coffin, so it actually smells of dead meat. And his two students, Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus and Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania, they went and they carried him out to meet Vespasian. He goes and he meets Vespasian, and he says, "Hail to you, the Roman emperor." So Vespasian looks left and right. He's like, "Are you crazy?" He says, "What are you saying that out loud?" He says, "If the emperor hears that that's what you're calling me, he's going to kill you and he's going to kill me." He's like, "I'm not the emperor, I'm the general." And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai replied back to him. He says, "No. It's only going to be a matter of time." He says, "You are indeed going to be the emperor, and Jerusalem will indeed fall in your hand." And while they're conversing, while they're talking, a messenger comes in, rushing in from Rome, and he says, "All hail, Emperor Vespasian. The emperor in Rome died, and now we're electing you, or the Senate went and elected you the Roman emperor." The general and now the emperor Vespasian was so impressed with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He says, "Ask me whatever you want, and I'll grant it to you." And he asked for a few things. Of the few things that he asked for, one of them was to spare the Chachamim, the sages in Yavne. Yavne was a location where a lot of the sages went and learned Torah. And that's what he asked for. He says he got to spare for them, because he realized, he says, if the temple's going to fall, everything's going to fall, the only thing that's going to hold the Jewish nation together is the Chachamim, is the sages that are going to be able to teach the Torah and continue on the Jewish legacy, if I may, the Jewish religion, and actually teach it over to the children of the Jewish nation. So he went and he got his wishes were granted. Now, during the time of the siege, there was three very, very wealthy people, and of these three wealthy people, one of them his name was Ben Kalva Savua. His name, is literally a very full dog. Why is it that it's considered why was his name like a very full dog? And the answer is because when somebody came in starving like a hungry dog, they came out so satisfied. They were so stuffed from his house that they were full, like satisfied as a dog. He was a big Baal Tzedakah. He gave a lot of charity, so much so that, and he was one of the wealthiest Jews at the time. He was able to support the entire Jerusalem for 21 years. There was three very wealthy people. They were able to support the entire Jerusalem for 21 years. And he was one of them that was, with his storehouses and the amount of food and resources that he had there, was enough to support Yerushalayim for 21 years. So during this time, during the siege of Yerushalayim, there was these wicked people that they wanted to fight the Romans, and the Jewish sages did not want to fight the Romans. They said, "Listen, it's not going to help. We have to surrender now." So what they decided to do was go and they burned down all the storage facilities that they had in Jerusalem. So they burned the entire place down to the ground, and the Jews then were starving to death, and many Jews died because of that. So his entire resources that was in Jerusalem was completely destroyed. Jerusalem was destroyed as well. So Ben Kalva went to move into his country home. He had a country home near Tveria. I'm assuming it's near Tveria. It was near the Kinneret, so I'm assuming it's in the area of Tveria. So he had there a very large estate, fields and pastures and sheep and a bunch of animals and vegetables, fruits. He had a whole system going on over there. So he goes over there and he moves into his country estate. And when he goes there, he takes along his daughter. His daughter is the only one that he has as family, immediate family. His wife passed away not too long ago, and so it's just him and his daughter Rachel. So while he's settling in, he's now looking for somebody to supervise all his sheep, all his, he had a lot of shepherds, he had a lot of cattle, and he needed somebody to oversee everything. He didn't have a son to do this. He didn't have a son to run over his business. So he decided he was looking to hire somebody. he got recommended a very, very bright person by the name of Akiva ben Yosef. Akiva ben Yosef was recommended to him by one of his neighbors, and he says, I heard a lot about this guy. He's a very, very bright guy. He knows a lot about the sheep. He knows a lot about the land. I would recommend to go and see maybe he'll be a good fit for it. So fine, they set up the meeting and they meet with Akiva meets with Ben Kava-The. He goes over there. And they start talking about the sheep, and he's starting to question him, and he sees that, Akiva ben Yosef is really, well versed in the business. So during this meeting, there's a knock on the door, and his daughter, Rachel, walks in. And she comes in and says, I'm sorry to disturb you, father, but there is a visitor that you're expecting, which was by the name of Papus ben Yehuda, is here, and he's waiting outside. So the father, the Kava-The says, listen, I'm in the middle of a meeting now. I can't attend to him right now. Please see him to the living room. Let him, make himself feel at home. Give him some food to eat, and I'll be out with him shortly. She says, fine. She closes the door and she leaves. Then Ben Kava-The goes over to, Akiva, and he says, he explains the situation. He says, this Papus is why I'm thinking of arranging a match between him and my daughter. And, he's a close, he knew his father. Ben Kava-The knew Papus' father. And he says, as long as the two, them get along, I want to this is going to be my shidduch. So, explains the situation, and they move on with the meeting. Then Ben Kava-The goes to Rabbi Akiva, before he was Rabbi Akiva, so it's just Akiva, and he tells him, and he says, what are your wages? How much are you going to charge me? What is it going to cost me? So, Rabbi Akiva says, listen, pay me according to the value of my labor. Now, Ben Kava-The really liked that. He says, I like that. He says, you know what, you're hired. He says, you're hired, just from that. So then he goes and he says, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be in charge of all the shepherds. You're going to make sure that they graze in the right places, that they're not stealing from people's grasses, and that when it's time to shear the wool, you're going to shear it and you're going to send it to the storage facilities, and you're going to be charging them all that. Then he asked him, and he says, listen, are you familiar with the laws of shchita, the laws of slaughtering? So he says, to be honest, I don't know anything about Judaism. And he says, I really don't, care so much for it. I just know basic history of Judaism. So he says, it's a shame because I would have put you also in charge of the slaughterhouses as well. But he says, okay, fine, we'll start off with this. Meanwhile, the meeting ends. He hires, Akiva, and now he goes up to his really a meal with his potential future son-in-law, Papus. So they go. This meal was not only him and his future possible son-in-law and his daughter. It was also a few of the neighbors, a few of the wealthy neighbors. They all came in and they were talking. They were discussing things that were going on in economics and politics and all things like that. And then obviously he came into the destruction of the temple because that's what was the hot topic back then. So they start talking about that. So Papus, this potential, son-in-law, goes and he says, it's our fault. We're blamed for all our suffering. So, one of the neighbors says, I agree with you. He says, God is punishing us for all our sins. So Papus says, no, that's not what I'm referring to. He says, what I'm referring to is that the reason why we're dealing with what we're dealing with is because we refuse to be like the other nations. If we would be like the Roman Empire, if we would be like everybody else, everybody would leave us alone. Why do they wouldn't care what we do? He says, because we stick out, and because we do our certain, things that we do, that we don't follow, go in with the flow with everybody else. He says, that's why we get prosecuted. So, they started, that's a very harsh statement to say to religious Jews. So he says, are you trying to tell us that we should, start worshipping idols and becomes like the Romans? So he's like, no, I'll never say to worship idols. You say rather, worship, believe in the one God, believe the basic tenets of Judaism, but everything else, everything after that, everybody should do whatever he sees fit. He says, and then we won't be, prosecuted. So Rachel was sitting over there, and Rachel was very, very devoted to not only to Judaism but to the continuation of the Jewish nation. And she says, I don't understand. She says, I'm but an uneducated girl, but if I may say something, it says, how do you expect the Jewish nation to last if they're only going to believe in one God and that's it, and the whole Torah is going to go, the Jewish nation is going to go as well. So she says just the opposite. She says, now that we don't have the temple, and now that we're getting prosecuted, now that we have to embrace the Torah even more strongly, this is the time that we have to remain loyal to our Father in heaven, and B'ezras Hashem, that will bring us a happier future. So, Kava-The was very happy with his daughter's answer. But Papus, replied back and he says, listen, I see you're very, enthusiastic about this, but you're living in a world of illusion, in a fantasy world. So the Roman Empire is not the Babylonian Empire. There are many, and he starts speaking about their philosophers. They don't even believe in these multiple gods. Plato, Aristotle, they don't believe in all this nonsense. But rather, I believe that this is what Papus says, is that we should believe in one God, and then do what we feel that is fit for us to do, and this way we'll be able to go and continue and live without being what's the word I'm looking for? Traumatized, like prosecuted. So the meeting ended, the meal ended, and everyone went to his own way. And meanwhile, Akiva, was working, and everybody was extremely impressed with him. He was very quick on his hands and feet, and he knew everything. He was very, very quick learner, and he basically got noticed, and in a good way. And Rachel was observing him as well also. She sees that, he's very smart. And one of the people during the meeting, in the meal, they said, oh, I see you have someone new coming around. I see you hired somebody new. It's like, this is Akiva ben Yosef, right? And he's like, yeah, I just hired him, to oversee all my shepherds. He says, that guy is, very, very bright head. He says, my son tried to get him to go to yeshiva for quite some time, but he refused to go to yeshiva. He says, a guy like that in yeshiva, forget about it. So Rachel was listening to all this the whole time. Meanwhile, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was getting sicker and sicker. He was ill, and it was time for him to leave the world. He had his two students. One of his many students. Two of his students was next to him. Was Rabbi Eliezer ben Horknus and Rabbi Shua ben Hanania, which is also going to be, we'll see in the future, is going to be Rabbi Akiva's teachers. And they go to visit the rabbi. Their dying rabbi, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and they see that the rabbi, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, is sitting there and crying. So it says, "Dear teacher," says, "Why are you crying?" This is what's going on. Why are you in tears? So the rabbi answers back, I'm going to, he says, he goes and explains to him, says, if I would go and be judged in front of a king of flesh and blood, then okay, I'll be able to bribe him, be able to do something about it, but I'm going to meet with the king of kings, Melech Malchei Amlachim. He says, should I not be afraid? So the two students go over to him and it says, teacher, please bless us. So he blessed them, he says, may you always have the fear of God in the way that you fear people. So they said, that's the blessing. He says, that's it. He says, Halavai, that it will be just that. Says you realize when someone's doing a sin, he doesn't look to see if God is watching him. He looks to see if somebody else is watching him. Somebody's in, he's home alone in the middle of the night, and he decides he wants to go on the computer. So what does he do? He looks left, he looks right, makes sure no one's watching, and then he lets his fingers and his Yetzer Hara go and run wild. However, let's say there was a group of people behind him. He would never do that. So what do we see over here? The fear of people is greater than the fear of God, because God watches everything. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, Halavai, that you should have the fear of God as much as you fear people. And then you really be protected from sin. So meanwhile, a short while later, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai returned his soul to his maker. And this tragic news spread like wildfire to the entire Jewish nation. And everybody was affected by it, including the whole Kabbalah Savua, the whole clan, the whole family. And the Ben Kabbalah Savua was very, very impressed with Akiva. Everything he did was amazing. Everything was said. But one thing bothered him. Everybody was mourning for the biggest rabbi. He was indifferent. So he goes over and he goes and he says, why is it that everybody else is mourning and you're not mourning? Like you don't feel pain and affected by the biggest rabbi in the world that passed away? And he says, no, to be honest, I'm indifferent. It doesn't matter to me. He says, these rabbis, what do we need these rabbis for? These are the rabbis that cause the separation. Even in his illiterate state, he loved the Jewish nation. He wanted the unity. He says these rabbis are causing disunity. What are they doing? They don't mingle with the secular. They don't go and involve themselves with the secular. You know how secular people think. They always think the bad because they don't really know that anything else. So he says they're the ones who created so much conflict amongst us. So he goes on and he says, no, absolutely, what are you talking about? He says, just the opposite. He says, the rabbis are the ones that unite us. He says, the reason why, you don't know, you never learned anything about it. You never learned how the rabbis actually teach the Torah. There's reasons for everything. So, meanwhile, Rachel was the most affected by the death of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And she's like, what's going to be the continuation of our nation? She says, now that we lost someone so great, we have to find a replacement. We have to find somebody that will be able to replace, up to a certain extent in the caliber of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And so she goes and she starts thinking of this Akiva. So she goes over to Akiva and she says, everybody's speaking about your keen mind and your strong will and your ability to perceive things. He says, why don't you leave my father's herds, leave the shepherd business behind you, and go to yeshiva and become a shepherd for your people? So he says, what do you mean? He says, I'm 40 years old. I don't even know how to read. He says, I can go and be able to go start learning now. And she says, listen, from what I hear, from what I see, your mental abilities are unsurpassed. He says, you'll be able to accomplish a lot. So she says, he says, listen, what's going to be my compensation for all of this? So she says, what do you mean? You're going to be, you're going to bring, you have eternal bliss in Olam Haba. You'll have eternal reward. You'll bring great contribution to the Jewish society, to the Jewish nation. So he says that's very nice and it's very, beautiful to hear, but says that doesn't put bread on the table. And with that, he says, not for me. It's really a shame. I've met in my lifetime many geniuses of people. You have like some sort of people that like they're like beyond geniuses. What does the Satan do with all these geniuses? If you ever realize, he puts them in such a situation that it will never come to learn Torah. Because if they learn Torah, they'll become like crazy high. So what do you have? There's like, I'll tell you what some of them do. I know a few of them that they're so smart. But what do they do all day? They play the dumbest video games. The video games, that like you build fields and you build this and then you dig holes and then you share farms and you like the craziest things that they do. These are the things that they enjoy playing. So Satan tries to take them out of learning Torah, just the opposite thing. They get involved in all these crazy stuff and they have brilliant minds. If they would put their minds in Torah, they would be able to get to reach such levels. So to the Satan, Rabbi Akiva had great potential, so he wanted to try to, as much as he can, to go and prevent him from learning Torah and from becoming someone great. So Rabbi Akiva, meanwhile, he goes and he continues his work, and while he appeared to reject everything that Allah said, it still was in his mind, sort of stuck in his mind. And he started thinking about the world, about the Torah, and about things like that, and so it really it dug into him. So one day he's walking past by, and Rachel, her father had a very large estate, and he had a few like streams of water flowing into the Kinneret. If you've ever been into the Kinneret, it's a beautiful huge land of water, and so he had a bunch of beautiful streams walking over there, and beautiful gardens. And she used to walk around the garden. She didn't have a mother. She didn't really have that many friends, so she would be a lot of herself in her own thought. One day Rabbi Akiva sees her on the ground, and he goes over to to her, and he says, forgive me, my the daughter of my master, for bothering your solitude, your moment of alone time. But you've told me things, and it's been constantly bothering me since you told me. He says, I have some questions about the Jewish nation. He says, what you're saying is so true about the continuity of the Jewish nation. He says, but why does the Jewish nation? Why do we suffer so much? Why do we have to go through so much suffering? So she replied back and says, listen, the greater the person's tasks in this world, the more issues that are involved in it. And I'll give you an example. This is not what she said, but I'll give you an example to understand this, which in his example I use pretty frequently. You have a CEO, he has more worries and more problems than somebody who is mopping the floors. Now why? They're both working at the same company. And the answer is because you have much more responsibilities than that guy. And hence you get paid for it more. So the Jewish nation, they have a lot of responsibility in this world. And hence, there's a lot of issues that come up and we have to deal with it. And he says, she explains it also as follows. There was a stream of water that was going down and into the Kinneret, and during the rushing stream there was a bunch of big rocks that were stationed right in front of the water. And what happens if you have a running stream and there's rocks? So the water hits the rocks, it splatters all over. And then it continues, it basically reassembles and it continues downstream. It says the water is like the nation of Israel. So the rocks is like the subjugating nations, the nations that want to harm us. It says they go and they place rocks, they place obstacles in our servants, in our ability to observe the mitzvot and the Torah according to the will of God. But what happens? So they block us and we split out into the entire world. But then what? We reunite together and we continue downstream into the water. She says, Rabbi Akiva was very impressed with the way that she was able to understand these things, and he's like, this is unbelievable. He says, I see you have a lot of, answers to these things. So he says, what does water have to do with the, Torah, and and she actually quoted him a pasuk from Yov. The water rubs out the rocks. He says even furthermore, he says if you look at the rocks, what happens to the rocks? If you have constant water flowing onto the rocks, it starts eroding the rock, or it smooths it out. It actually could break through the power of the rocks, which we'll soon see of the most famous stories of Rabbi Akiva. So he started asking her a bunch of other questions. So he says, listen, how could, start asking the most famous question about free will. How could you have free will if God knows what's going to happen in the future, and God knows what I'm going to do, so how could I have free will, and then hence, how could I be punished for things that I do? She goes over to him, she says, listen, you're asking me all these questions, I'm an educated girl. Says, I don't learn Torah. Says, go to yeshiva, learn Torah, and you'll get all the answers. He says, are there really answers for all these questions? I says, absolutely, you go to Torah. So he kept on asking her questions over here. Some of them she answered him. Says, why is it that we have so many troubles in our time? He lived in a time of tremendous trouble. So, to the Jewish nation. So she goes and she starts explaining to him. She says, listen, says the Jewish nation, when they were born into slavery, in Mitzrayim, they had a very, very hard time. Says, well, what's going on with us? Why do we have to go through such hard times? Little did they know that their children is going to be the people that are going to get the Torah. Says, and she goes and she says, Rachel goes to Rabbi Akiva and she says, you know what was able to go and hold the Jewish nation together? It was in the merit of the woman. When the men gave up, the women, were continuing, and they were giving the faith for the men to continue their work. And when the men didn't want to have any children, the women were able to reboost their emunah, reboost their faith, and be able to continue. And because of the woman, that's why we were able to survive. So Rabbi Akiva is sitting there and looking, and he's sighing. He's like, says, if only I'll be able to find a wife like that, like someone like you, then I will need to, happily dedicate my life to the learning of Torah. And he was just, saying it as a just as a passing statement. And she replied back to him, which he didn't expect. He says, if I knew that one day you become a great teacher of Torah, of the Jewish nation, I would not turn you down. So he was like, what? So he replies back. He says, listen, how am I can't promise I become a great teacher. That's who knows, So she goes and she says, regardless, if you would promise that you would dedicate your life to Torah, regardless of whether you feel you're in the condition of becoming a teacher or not, I would not turn you down for the marriage offer. And then she gets up, and with the final word, she says, speak to my father, and she left, and she walked off. Rabbi Akiva was like stunned. He says, he's never even in his wildest dream thought that he would be able to marry, or even have the possibility of entertaining the idea to marry one of the wealthiest persons in the people alive in Israel at the time, his daughter. So he's thinking, and he was extremely impressed with Rachel. Everything that she said so was wise with her enthusiasm for the Jewish nation. He was extremely, extremely impressed with her. And he's saying, if only you were poor, like me, I would feel comfortable marrying you. I would, take it from, so it really made him nervous. He wasn't able to go and bring this up to their father, Kal And he didn't have the courage, so to speak. But he says, if I ever marry you, I will make a vow that I dedicate my life to learning and starting the Holy Torah. Meanwhile, days go by, and Kal goes and he brings in back his Akiva, and he says, we never discussed monetary payment, like what's it going to be? So Rabbi Akiva was very nervous, and he says, listen, I would like to make a request in a slightly different manner. He says, release me from my duties so that I could go study Torah, as your daughter promised to marry me on the condition that I learn Torah. This is what the servant is basically telling the master. So the Kal was so astonished. He was shocked. He was looking at Akiva, and he's like, he's like, has a demon gone inside of you? He's like, are you kidding me? He says, marry my daughter? So he says, Akiva replies back. He says, listen. He says, I'm aware of the, of the craziness of the way it sounds, but I would never bring it up unless she brought it up to me. So it's like impossible, Kal says. He calls all the servants, bring in my daughter, bring in Rachel. So Rachel walks into the room, confident, standing up tall, standing up straight, just walks right into the room. And, Kal goes over to her and he says, listen, there's something that's been bothering me. He says, you've always been a great girl, always listen. I never felt the need to discipline you. And that's what makes me so hard to understand what's going on over here. This person that's standing in front of me, Akiva, he is claiming that you told him that you will marry him if he goes to learn Torah. Not only is he poor, not only is he ignorant, he comes from he comes from the Avodah Zarah. He's a convert to the Jewish nation. So Rachel replied back, says, listen, even my father, Akiva, with all that, it's true, but he has such a gift in mind. If he's going to spend his days and his nights learning Torah, with his intellectual abilities, he will become one of the greatest teachers in the Jewish nation. So, the father replied back to her, he's like, foolish child. He says, this guy is 40 years old. He says, what makes you think he'll be able to overcome everything that he missed in his early years? He says, he doesn't want to marry you because he learns Torah. He wants to marry you for the money. He wants to marry you for the wealth. So Akiva was sitting there the whole time, and he's like, listen, my dear master, you judged me wrong. He says, I want you to marry your daughter for herself, not for the money. And even if she would be poor, I would be happy to marry her, even if she would be as poor as me. So, Ben Kal goes and says, if she was as poor as you, how would you go and learn Torah? It really got him in a good, tight situation up there. So Rachel responded back, and he says, if I were as poor as Akiva, I would go and work so that he, my husband, would be able to go and fulfill his mission and learn Torah undisturbed. And so the father replies back to her. He says, you're only saying that because you never had a day of hunger in your life. You don't know what it means to be poor. You've never experienced hunger. So she replies back to him and says, you're right. I've never experienced hunger, but I'm not afraid of it. She goes to him and says, you have such a love for the Jewish nation, and you are willing to give up your storage houses to feed the Jewish nation for 21 years until it was burned down. Says, I too have that love for the Jewish nation, but I want to give something to the Jewish nation that can be burnt down by a physical fire. And that is the fire of the Holy Torah. The fire that the Torah was able to continue on with generation to generation. So, Ben Akiva-The was extremely upset about the situation. And he goes and he says, you're supposed to leave my house you're going to leave my house this very day. He tells Akiva. He says, this is not the place for you anymore. And he goes over to his daughter, Rachel, and he says, listen, I'll go to Yavne, the biggest yeshiva place in the world at the time. I will get you the best student possible that is able to learn. I will bring him here to you, and you can marry him and learn Torah, with a student for your entire life. And Rachel said, listen, my dear father, I have given Akiva my word, and I will commit to it, and I will never marry anybody else. And now Akiva got really angry. And he says, and he stands up and he says, I no longer consider you, if you go and you continue with this, I no longer consider you my daughter. And he says, listen well to the vow that is going to come out of my mouth right now about this. And he says, and this is what Akiva says, you will not receive anything, not the slightest thing from all my possessions. You are not to take a thing from this house with you, except with the clothing that you're wearing on you. And then he goes over to her and says, now choose between him or me. That's what her father said. And Rachel replied back and says, Father, as God is my witness, it hurts me deeply that I angered you. The riches I could part with. I don't have a problem with that. But one thing that I'll miss the most is your fatherly love. So he replies back there, so you made up your mind? And she said yes. So Akiva says to leave with this man. And she had to leave with her, with her potential future husband, Akiva. And they left. And they actually got married. They went and they had a very modest wedding and they got married. Now, to fulfill his end of the deal, now they had to go and, go to yeshiva. So they traveled to a nearby town, a very poor village. She went and she sold everything that she had that was of wealth of her. With the money that she had, she had some jewelry on her. She was able to, expensive clothing. She sold that and they bought a very, very modest 2-bedroom house. 2-bedroom, I shouldn't say a house, 2-bedroom hut, and barely furnished, and that's where they were going to live. Now, after they got married, so he goes and he says, okay, now it's time to go and learn in yeshiva. I have to stand up to my word with you. And she goes and she says, okay, let me go find the rabbi. She goes and she meets the big rabbi in the area, and she starts speaking to him. Says, listen, I want my husband to come and learn with you Torah. And this rabbi is looking at her and he says, my dear daughter, he says, you look so familiar. He says, what is your name? So she says, I'm Rachel, the son of Akiva-The. So the rabbi is looking shocked. He says, what happened to your father? Did he lose all his money? He's looking at her. She's a poor, pauper. She's ripped clothes, looks like she lost all her money. She said, no, Chas v'shalom, my father still has all his money. So he goes and says, so, what's going on over here? Why are you dressed like a pauper? We're like, what's going on? So she explains to him the whole situation about her father, about Akiva, and how, he made a vow that he's not allowed to use any of her possessions, and now that's why she's here. She wants to go on her husband now to learn Torah. So the rabbi was very, very impressed with her. And he says, your self-sacrifice will be praised by our people for thousands of years, and you will serve as a role model to the daughters of Israel. And he says, of course, bring your husband over. And to bring the husband over, the husband, it comes in, and the rabbi speaks to him and says, so what do you know about Torah? So he says, to be honest, nothing. He says, do you know how to read? Nope. Do you know the alphabet? Nope, nothing. So wow. So he says, we got to start you on the beginner level. And they start teaching him. They start teaching him Aleph Bet. A 40-year-old man is going and he's learning Aleph Bet with a bunch of children. A bunch of children are sitting in a class and he's learning the basics. And he was one of the things that made Rabbi Akiva so great is he didn't take anything for granted. He says, okay, the Aleph makes this noise and it's spelled like this. Right away he asks a question. He says, why is the Aleph spelled like that? Why is the Aleph looked like this way? Why is, what? And he started asking all these questions. And the rabbis went and they answered him. Meanwhile, a few days go by and they're learning the alphabet, and the entire place, everyone's laughing at him. Here you have a tall man. One of the characteristics that we know about about Akiva is most likely he was bald. So you have a tall 40-year-old bald man sitting in a classroom, a bunch of little children learning the alphabet. Everyone's laughing. The whole place is it's a joke. So he goes over to Rachel and says, listen, I'm trying over here, but, they're laughing at me nonstop. It's very difficult. So his wife, the wisdom that she has, unbelievable lessons that you can learn from her. Wow. She goes to him and says, I totally understand you, my dear husband. He says, no problem. Says, but I have a request for you. He says, of course, my wife, anything. And she says, they had a donkey, or they borrowed a donkey. And says, take this donkey, and I want you to put soil on its back. And he puts soil on his back, and then she says, I want you to go and plant some seeds on his back. He goes and he plants some seeds on his back. Then she says, I want you to water it. And within a few days, he's watering it. I guess the seeds that grew very quickly, and a little flower started sprouting from this donkey's back. And she goes over to him and he says, listen, I want you to go and take this to the market. Just walk around. Don't sell anything. Don't do anything. Just walk around the market. Just whatever you want, my dear wife. Anything that you want, I will do. He takes the donkey and he starts walking around the market. He comes home that night and she says, so how was the walk in the market? He says, to be honest, it was brutal. He says, I walked into the market, everyone was pointing and laughing. Look at this guy who has a donkey that's growing flowers from its back. And she says, wow, that is tough. He says, but do me a favor, do it tomorrow as well. Says, whatever you want, my dear wife, I'll do it. The next day goes, and he brings the donkey back into the market. And people, again, are laughing, pointing and laughing. Look at this guy, he's going crazy. Look, he has a donkey that's growing, he has grass growing on this donkey. He comes back home, and for the next few days, she tells him, keep on bringing it back. Just walk around it. And after about a week or so, she goes over to Akiva and says, Akiva, tell me, so what is there? How's it been in the marketplace with the donkey? He says, to be honest, it's not so bad anymore. He says, people got sort of used to it. It's like, oh yeah, here's the guy, the crazy guy with the donkey and the flowers, and no one even laughed at me, no one pointed, no one did anything to me about it. So the genius of the wife, Rachel, goes over to her husband. So this is woman should learn from this amazing story. She goes over to him and she says, listen, you're right, they're going to laugh at you at yeshiva. They're going to laugh at you, yeah. But just like they laughed at you and the donkey for a few days, eventually they stop. So too, keep on going to yeshiva. Don't worry about it. They're going to laugh at it. Eventually they're going to get used to it. They're going to see, oh, this is the guy that learns in pre-1A. Don't worry about it. And then, you'll be able to continue without any issues. And Kachaya, and this is how he went. He went back to yeshiva, and they laughed at him. And then eventually they got used to it. They got used to the guy, learning as a older man with a bunch of basic Judaism with Aleph Bet and all the basics with all the kids. So meanwhile, Akiva was studying nonstop. He was learning day in, day out. And meanwhile, his wife had to go and support the family. So while Akiva was learning, nonstop, his wife was working nonstop in any, odd job that she could find to possibly put food on the table. And she kept on taking a little money and saving it on the side so that she would be able to go and, eventually there's going to come a time when B'ezrat Hashem there will be a Mazel Tov and you're not going to be able to really work. So she wanted to save some extra sum in case that comes. So meanwhile, she saves a small amount and time goes by. And there was a person in their town by the name of Eliyahu, and he was extremely, extremely poor. And not only that, he broke his leg and he wasn't able to work. And at the same point in time, his wife gave birth to a baby. And now, they have a baby expense. And now they have, he's not able to work. They actually have to sell every possession that they have. And then they had nothing left. So people were, it was a poor town. Nobody was able to give money. And, he goes over to Akiva. He sees him walking past by. He's like, Akiva, do you have something to pay, something to put food on the table? I got nothing. So Akiva feels terrible. This is for another fellow Jewish person. So he goes over to his wife Rachel, after he comes home, and he says, listen, he says there's somebody who's even poorer than us. He says, can you imagine that? Which made him feel also a little bit good because it bothered him about the condition that his wife was living in. The wife was living, every morning she had to wake up, she had to pull straw out of her hair because they used to sleep on straw, and it really bothered him that they were living in such poverty. And now that there was someone who was poor, it gave a little bit of a, it's not that bad. It could be worse. So he says, I wish we had some extra money, not only that we could live better, but rather that we could, at least alleviate some of the issues and the suffering that our neighbors has. So she says, listen, I have been saving some sort of money. And she goes and she runs in, takes her savings, the little savings that she has, she says, here, we have some little money saved up. I was saving it for a certain occasion, but go ahead and bring it to the poor person. So he takes the money, and he's like, unbelievable. He says, your trust in God, Rachel, is not only as it's greater than your love for the Torah, that you're able to give the little thing that we have away to somebody else. And he goes and he starts praising her. He says, I am the wealthiest man in the world. He says, I do not envy the Roman emperor with all his wealth. He says, I got the best deal in the entire world. I got the best wife, and I am the wealthiest person. Meanwhile, he takes the money, he brings it over to this poor person, Eliyahu, and his family. Eliyahu is sitting in there, and he's like, oh my God, thank you so much, it's so unbelievable. He's like praising him, Akiva, you're unbelievable, you're amazing. Akiva says, no, listen. He says, you're praising the wrong person, it has nothing to do with me. It's my wife that you have to thank. It's my wife. She's the one that gave this. So he continues going, and he continues learning. Meanwhile, after a short while later, Rachel gives birth to a baby. And she's home, and he's not able to, she's not able to support the family. So he goes over to his rabbi and says, listen, I'm going to be coming in a little bit late every morning. I'm going to have to go and make some money. I'm going to start working a little bit in a few hours in the morning. And he went and he became like a wood chopper. So he chopped some wood. He goes and he's chopping the wood, and he takes the wood, and now he uses the wood to sleep on. He uses the wood to for fire, and then he sells the wood. He basically, everything evolves around that. So much so that this is the level of his devotion that he was able to learn. He took a piece of wood, basically a torch, and with that he used to go and read over review at night, all the learning that he missed during the day, because now that he was working. So he was sitting there with a torch in his hand and reading the old scrolls, and he's learning. And meanwhile, his hand starts burning, and he realized the entire thing went down and it burned his hand. He was so engrossed in his learning, he didn't even realize that it was coming close to his hand. So this is such a lesson that you can learn from this as well. You have two people that are coming even to a class. There's one person that can learn 1,000 times more than the other person. Two people are sitting and learning Torah. One person can sit and learn Torah and be like, okay, whatever, let's say they're listening to Shul Torah. So they're listening to it, they're doing 7,000 things at the same time, which is great. At least they're listening to Shul Torah, right? They're listening to, let's say, in Torah anytime, right? You have it playing in the background, and then you're on the web, searching and browsing for shopping for shoes. Which is granted, it's great. Keep on doing what you're doing, you're learning. But it's not the same that if you're sitting and you're concentrating, you're learning Torah. There are two people that can be learning Torah and they're sitting in the shul. One of them is spacing out, one of them thinking. One other person is learning and constantly focused, constantly, in his mind is in Torah. We learn more than 1,000 times than another person. Rabbi Akiva was the type of person, when he's learning Torah, he was all in it. He didn't even feel the fire that was burning down in his hand. So once he made enough money, you think somebody makes enough money. So now what do? You put some money on the side, you save it, maybe eventually open up a business, and then you'll be able to get even more money, and then you have workers, then you can save and learn more Torah. Akiva wasn't like that. Once he had enough money that would last him for a few days, he stopped working. So he stopped working, went to the yeshiva full time. Once he ran out of money, then he went back to work for another few days. So Akiva, when he had his love and his thirst for Torah was so great that he had a thirst for knowledge in general. He did not only go and learn just only focus on Torah. He met a doctor, he would start questioning him about every little detail about it and learn from that also. He met a mathematician, he started speaking to him about math. Astronomers, a linguist, no matter any craftsman that he met, he would go and he would start interrogating them and finding out more information about it. And he would make use of that for the Torah as well. Meanwhile, at this point in time, there was the famous Titus. He went and he destroyed the temple. So he went and he was at sea, and God was basically making this tremendous, crazy wave and crazy storm that it looked like his entire ship is going to drown. So he goes over and he stands on his deck and he realizes, okay, God, the God of the Jews, I know this is what you're doing to me. He says, because I destroyed your temple. He says, but I see that you have only power on water. He says, yeah, you're able to beat me on water. Paro, you destroyed in water. Me, I destroy your temple. Where are you going to get me at water also, at the sea? So he says, Titus replies and says, listen, you want to fight me? Fight me mano a mano on land. Let's see how much you'll be able to do that. So God says, all right, you want to play like that? No problem. He goes, instantly the entire sea becomes quiet. He goes, the second that he steps foot on the ground, Hashem says, God tells him, not only am I going to get you, I'm going to send my smallest messenger to go and kill you. And he sends a mosquito. This tiny little mosquito, this little fly. He goes in, the second that he steps on the ground, this mosquito flies into his nostril and goes into his, into his brain. And this mosquito started, nibbling at the brain. And this was causing, Titus tremendous headaches, tremendous pain and suffering. And one day he's walking around and he passed by this craft shop they're doing their baking because they're making the swords, whatever they're doing, and they're making it. And he realized it with all this noise. Suddenly his head stopped hurting. The fly in there sort of the noise got disturbed it, and it sort of was resting. So Titus says, all right, this is what I have to do. And he went and he hired an entire entourage of people just to make a noise wherever he goes. So this way that the fly would be calm. This lasted for about 30 days until the fly got used to the noise. And then he started, kept on, biting, kept on going on in its brain. And eventually it took about 2 years where Titus died. And they did an autopsy on him. They opened up his head and they saw this huge, humongous fly that basically ate up most of the majority of his brain. And, so when he was and he was emperor at that point in time. So when he was, after Titus's death, his brother Domitian, also pronounced, he took over as emperor. So during this time, during this time, I know, I'm sorry, Willie, I'm going to go a little bit further because I want to try to get in, but if anybody needs to leave, even if I just say, yeah. So he goes, and the Jewish nation decide that now that there's a new emperor, let us go and let us send a delegation to, basically, become on his good side. Give him a nice, sizable, beautiful, donation to his empire on his coronation day, and help him on his maybe get a good relationship between the Jews and the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire, they were subjugated under that nation. So the person that was chosen to go and to become the messenger was Nachum Ish Gamzu, which was Rabbi Akiva's rabbi. Nachum Ish Gamzu. So, Nachum Ish Gamzu goes to the student and says, listen, Akiva, I got to go now. They send me as a delegation. I have to go for the Jewish nation. I need to go and travel now to Rome. So he says, Akiva says, so what are we going to do about our learning? He says, we need to learn Torah. How am I going to learn Torah? He was so thirsty for Torah. He says, what do you mean? I'm going to leave a few months, not going to learn Torah? So, Nachum Ish Gamzu said, listen, says, come along with me. We'll learn on the way. So nowadays, what do? You're sitting over there, you travel for 6 hours, right? You say you have to sit there and you have to watch the in-flight entertainment, and you have to go and you have to relax, and it's also mind-boggling. They traveled for months. They had to travel for weeks, if not months, on a ship, sacrificing their life just to get to a certain location. Besides the seasickness and the storms that they had to go through, besides the starvation and the amount of who knows what the troubles and the tribulations that they had to go through from traveling. Nowadays, we sit on this, this airplane, and then, we start complaining if there's a little shakiness. People don't even realize you're sitting on a flying dumpster with 200 people that who knows how is flying, how many people there know about aerodynamics, and it's flying at, 600 miles per hour, thousands upon thousands of feet in the air, and you get air conditioning, you get entertainment, you get warm food served to you, you could go to the bathroom, there's a running toilet. If you have enough money, you could go on the Emirates flight and you could actually go and you could actually take a shower on the plane. So you have all these things how was the flight? Oh man, it was so much turbulence, it was for 10 minutes it was shaking. You're flying on a plane, you're flying on a piece of metal flying through the air. No, it's not a dumpster. I should have said, you're flying in a missile. You're basically flying in a missile, and yet we complain. But anyways, what do? We go there, we have a hard time sleeping, we start complaining. Nachum Ish Gamzu and Rabbi Akiva, they're going, they're traveling for months on the boat. What do they do on the boat? They go and they sit on the breeze, and enjoy the water over there, and singing in the song while on the deck. They were learning Torah. They were learning non-stop Torah. So they went and they continued learning Torah. And Nachum Ish Gamzu went with his rabbi, and he was learning in the journey. So while they weren't learning, Nachum Ish Gamzu, found an opportunity also to learn about these sailors. He learned from every single person that came to him. So he started watching the sailors, how they navigate the ship, how they do that, and he started learning everything about that has to do with the ship and the navigation and the seas and things like that. Meanwhile, Rabbi Akiva was up on the top deck, and I guess Nachum Ish Gamzu was either not around or down below the deck, and there was a crazy storm that came into effect, and the ship was going backwards and forwards, and the bunch of drunk sailors were rolling all the place back and forth. Everyone screaming, "That's it! This is the end. This is we're gonna die." And Akiva stands up, tall man. He quiets everybody down. Says, "Listen, everybody." He says, "Don't worry about it. We're not going to die. I have my holy rabbi, my holy teacher is over here. He's so holy, it's not going to die because of him." He says, "Come, let us go together and pray it for God." And he stands over there and he starts praying to God. He says, "God, please save us and have mercy on us." And people see him, they were very impressed with, just his ability to do whatever he just did. And they all started praying with him. And shortly afterwards, a few minutes go by, and the entire sea calms down. So there was a person that was that was near there, near Akiva at that time, and his name was Flavius Clemens. And he goes over to Akiva and he says, "I'm extremely impressed with what you just did. So you should know that I'm closely related to the emperor. And if you ever need anything," he didn't have cards back then, but imagine it's here's my card, call me, if you ever need anything. So they went and they continued, and shortly they landed on land. And the majority of the entire crew was so seasick by the entire storm that they just had that they actually became sick. So they needed to rest. So they rested at an inn before continuing to the Roman capital. So while they're sitting through the inn, they're going in there and they check in their luggage, I guess if you may. And in their luggages is this magnificent chest with all the jewels and the diamonds that the Jews collected to give to the Emperor Domitian. So they go in and they hand in this beautiful chest, and the innkeeper takes it, puts it on the side of sidekeeping, and the innkeeper wife look at it and be like, "Wow, it's a nice looking chest. I wonder what's inside it." So the innkeeper says, "Well, let's check it." They go, they pick the lock, whatever they do, they open it up. and they see this entire thing is full of jewels and a tremendous value. So suddenly they're like, we're rich. Says, what are we supposed to do over here? So the innkeeper says, listen, I have an idea. He goes and he takes out all the jewels, puts it in his safe. He goes into the backyard, digs out some dirt, and fills up the chest with dirt. And he closes the chest, locks it back up again, and says, no one will be the wiser. When they will, we'll deny it. So they go after a short while. Nachumish Gamzu and Rabbi Akiva, they go and they start feeling better, and they continue their journey to Rome. They go, they take the chest, and they start making their way towards Rome. They get to Rome. They get to the capital, and they go, they see the Emperor Domitian, and they say, listen, Domitian, he says, we have a gift on behalf of the Jewish nation. We want to go and congratulate you on your becoming the emperor, and here's your gift. And he looks at this magnificent, a chest with, beautiful, bedazzled all around. He says, wow, I wonder what's going to be inside here. It's so amazing. He opens it up, and to his shock, he sees a bunch of old dirt. And he starts screaming, the Jews, they're mocking me. He says, this is what they think, that, they're not going to go untouched with this. He says, look at this. I just became emperor, and they send me dirt. They're thinking that I'm dirt. So meanwhile, who was present at this point in time? Flavius Clemens, the guy who was on the boat, was also present. And he was like, oh, hold up, emperor. He says, I was with these two sages on the boat. He says, these two are not these just your run-of-the-mill sages. And someone else piped up and says, listen, he says, the Jews, they were known, their forefather Abraham, had special dirt, that when he would go and he would fight at war and he would throw this dirt will turn into like missiles and bombs and arrows and knives and everything, and it would be able to take apart the entire thing.Maybe this is a magical dirt. So the emperor Domitian, he says, you know what? He says, that intrigued him. He says, magical dirt. And, I like that. They believed in those type of things. Back then, very, very superstitious. So he says, if this is that powerful dirt, he says, I could definitely use some of it. One of the things that Domitian was lacking is that he was foretold, and his father also told us to him. He says the astrologers told his father that Domitian, he's going to die by the sword. That's what's going to be his end. So the entire family, everybody, he was not allowed to go into war because they realized if he goes into war, he'll die. One of the things that the honor that an emperor gets is after he comes back from war, there is a tremendous parade for him. Like the entire capital comes back after, obviously, he wins a war. So there's tremendous honor that this Domitian was lacking. So he's like, listen, he's like, I'm not, but if I'm able to go into war with this, he says, dude, this changes everything. There was a certain Germanic tribes that were causing problems to the empire, and they weren't able to rebel them. They weren't able to actually subdue them. This rebellion. So he goes and he says, all right, lock up these sages. I'm going to go and test it up. And he goes to him, Flavius Clemens, you're in charge while I'm gone. So he goes, he takes the dirt, he packs it up with his entourage, and he leaves. Meanwhile, Flavius Clemens goes and he releases the sages from the prison, and he says, listen, he says, I'm releasing you, but you have to promise me that you're not leaving the country. You have to stay in the area until he comes back, until we get it through, but I'm not going to keep you locked up. You can go as you please. So they agreed, they promised, they gave him his word, and they just hung around and waited. Meanwhile, what were they doing? Learning Torah. The same thing that they do everywhere else that they go. And while they weren't learning Torah, so Rabbi Akiva was going and he was admiring the land. He saw all these statues and the architecture, and he was again learning from every single aspect of it. And he also was conversing with the population. The population, however, spoke Latin, not with the language he spoke in Hebrew. So he actually started picking up Latin, and he started as he was conversing, he was very bright and he was able to pick up things very quickly. And he goes and one of these days he's going and he's looking at the one of those wondrous magnificent the structures that they built, and he feels a hand on his shoulder. He turns around and it's his new friend Flavius Clemens, and he says, it's beautiful, isn't it? Isn't Rome magnificent? So he says, Akiva looks at it and he says, it's beautiful, but you see, you guys are focusing only on the worldly pleasure. So it's all going to fall and crumble on one day. Rome would also fall and crumble. Everything's going to fall and crumble. Flavius comes and says, okay, listen. He says, be careful how you speak about Rome. Like the Mavrasha. You don't speak about certain things. Mother Rome. You got to be careful. I'm in charge. If they hear you say about that, that's not going to be good for you. So he says, he's conversing in Latin, and he says, I'm surprised to see you here for such a short period of time, and you're able to converse in Latin so fluently. So he says, I pick it up, I'm learning it. So he says, listen, I want to introduce you to my wife, Domitella. says his Clemens' wife, Domitilla, she was a granddaughter of the Emperor Vespasian, and she was also the niece of the emperors Titus and Domitian. So right now she is the niece of the current emperor Domitian. So he says, she wanted to meet you because she wanted to express her thanks that because of you the entire ship was saved. So Rabbi Akiva again says, listen, it wasn't me, it was my teacher's merit. He says, oh, I'm just a beginner, I'm just a student. So, Flavius Clemens says, listen, I've been around the block. I could see you and I could see your knowledge abilities. He says, even if you just started, you're no beginner. So they go and he invites him over to his house. And they go and they sit with Domitilla, and Flavius Clemens is sitting there with his wife. And they start talking. And they start talking about Judaism and everything that he asks. And Rabbi Akiva starts explaining to him. And this couple becomes fascinated with Judaism. And they start asking all these things. And suddenly a servant comes into the room. And he says, our master dinner is ready. So Domitilla goes over to Akiva and says, Akiva, are you going to join us for dinner as well? So, Akiva says, I can't. Now picture what somebody would say. You meet somebody who saved your life basically from the emperor, who because of him you are alive today, and then he goes and he invites you over to a meal in his house. You're going to be able to say no? Well, Akiva doesn't play any games. He says I can't. He says all your food is impure. He says we have certain laws about slaughter, and I can't eat in your impure. Like he didn't fluff it up. He's like, say it as it is. So. And they respected him for that. So he says, how do you live? How are you surviving over here? He says, we live off the fruits. Me and my teacher, we live off the fruits of the land. So she says, okay, we understand. He says, I guess you're free to go, but please come back. We're very fascinated about this whole Judaism. And it says, very interesting things that you've been telling us that we never heard before. We'd like to converse with you again. So he leaves. Meanwhile, the emperor, Domitian, he goes and he meets this delegation, or not the delegation, the rebellion. He basically travels to the rebellion, and he takes the sand, and he goes to the front lines, and he throws the sand, and a miracle happened. It actually turned into like these bombs and these crazy swords and this crazy thing, and it scared the entire rebellion, and he was able to subdue them with a very very quickly amount of time. When the news came back to the capital about what look at how great we were trying to subdue this rebellion for who knows how long. Now the emperor comes, within a day everything is done. So he comes in, there's a tremendous parade from him, he's getting his kavod up the wazoo, and he is loving it. And he's going over there, he's so happy. He goes right when he comes back, he goes and he starts giving sacrifices to the Jupiter god, they used to, all the avodah zarah that they used to worship. And then he goes and he calls in the Jewish sages. And he thanked them publicly for what they did. He says, the land that unbelievable, I am forever grateful for you. And he took the box, he emptied out all the dirt, scrapped all the dirt, cleaned it out, mopped it out inside, took all the dirt, put it in a very safe place, and then he filled that entire thing up with the emperor's level of gifts, full of jewels, diamonds, gold, coins, everything to the top, and says, here's my present back to you, and peace be on you. And they go and they leave. As they leave, they stop by the same inn. So they, see what goes on. So, and word came out about what happened. The emperor, how much he did it publicly, how much he, for the dirt, this amazing dirt that that these sages brought in. So meanwhile, the innkeeper hears about this. The innkeeper's wife hears about this, and they're like, "It's our dirt. This is dirt from our backyard." He says, "Let's go. Let's bring it also. Maybe the emperor would also reward us." So they go and they fill up this beautiful. They get this huge chest, even double the size from what they had before, and they fill it up and they travel to the capital. They go into the capital and they stop him in the front and he says, "Can I help you?" He says, "Yeah, we're here to bring the same dirt that the sages brought in, the powerful magical dirt. It came from my backyard." He says, "I'm bringing it to the emperor. I'm giving him more. I heard he enjoyed it so much. I want the amazing emperor. I want to give him more gifts." So they heard about this, so they said, "Oh, amazing!" They brought them right in, and they went and they tried this out. So, all right, listen, this is a powerful dirt. Let's try it. They go, they throw it in the air. It starts blowing back in their face. It's going back. It's like they throw another batch. Nothing. It's plain dirt. The emperor says, "You trying to make a fool of me?" He says, "Now do you think that I gave somebody to think every fool that's going to bring dirt, I'm just going to?" He says, "These two are making a mockery of the emperor," and he had them all killed. The entire crew over there. So Meanwhile, they go the Chachamim, the sages, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Nachum Ish Gamzu, they go and they travel back to the homeland, back to Israel. And meanwhile, they each go settle back in. A few days go by, and Rabbi Akiva goes to visit his rabbi to continue to learn from him. And what he sees shocks him. He sees his rabbi. He's sitting over there, and he's paralyzed, unable to move his arms, unable to move his legs. He has boils everywhere. And he says, "Rabbi, dear Rabbi, what happened? What's going on over here?" He says, "It pains me to see that you're suffering so." So the rabbi says, "No, just the opposite." He says, it's good that I'm suffering now. I'm suffering for my sins. He says, "What sins? What happened?" And he starts explaining to him, I was traveling. I was going to visit my father-in-law. And as I was traveling, some poor man came and asked me for food. And I got off my donkey and I started unpacking, and I was walking slowly. And by the time I turned around to give him some food, I realized that he was so starving that he kneeled over and died. He died from starvation because I didn't go and I didn't give him fast enough. So it says it's good that you see me suffering now, so at least I don't have to suffer in the next world. So, a short while later, he goes, Nachum Ish Gamzu goes and he returns his soul to his maker. And again, the entire Israel mourned another great leader and the death of this amazing teacher of the Jewish nation. Meanwhile, you have over here Rabbi Akiva, his rabbi just passed away, and he doesn't have anybody to learn from. So he goes, and him and his wife Rachel, they decide that he is going to go to yeshiva in Yavne. Yavne was the big capital where yeshiva is. There were two big, the big chachamim of that time, Rabbi Elazar ben Horkenes and Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania. So they go. He says, she decided, I want you to go, and I want you to go learn over there. Rachel says. So she goes. One of her friends go over to her and say, listen, to travel there is 3.5 days of travel time. Each way. So it says, I don't understand. You're going to send your husband there. He's going to travel 3.5 days, stay there for a half a day, then travel back for Shabbat. How's it going to be? Achaz says, oh, no, I would never make him travel for me. He says, that waste 3.5 days of traveling, a week of traveling every time. So no. I wanted to stay there. The going rate was when you go and learn in Yeshiva, you stay there for 12 years. I wanted to stay there for 12 years and learn. And she says, Rachel, are you crazy? He says, what do you mean? You'd say, you're sitting there in dire poverty. You had everything. Rachel would have been able to marry the richest person in the world. She didn't even need to marry the richest person in the world. Could have married anybody. She still wouldn't have to work a day in her life, have maid servants, everything that she wanted instantly. And yet she gave it all up so that her husband could learn Torah. Says, but not only that, now, not only you're giving up that, now you're giving up your husband as well, so you're going to raise your kids, you're going to support your family somehow, and you're going to send your husband away for 12 years and not even going to be able to see him, and for sacrifice, well, how much can you sacrifice already? And it says, whatever I need to do to get him to learn Torah, that's what I will do. And she goes and she sends him to learn Torah. Nowadays, for all the married women that are listening, they go and you have the husband wants to go and learn Torah. Oh, he never spends time with me. We want to go. We want to say, And granted, you are supposed to spend time with your wives. It is extremely important. No, it's an obligation that you need to spend time with your wife, and you have to make sure you spend some time with your wife. But some women, they refuse to let their husbands go and learn Torah. And if they don't refuse it, do you at least push your husband to learn Torah? Look at how much lessons you can learn from Rachel. How much he pushed Rabbi Akiva, and look what he became. He became the greatest. Why? Because he had a strong woman behind him. So he goes and she sends Rabbi Akiva to go and learn in Yavne, learn there for 12 years. He goes into the yeshiva, Rabbi Akiva, and he sits by the teacher's feet, doesn't say a word, and he just soaks everything in. He's sitting over there and he's like learning. Years go by. Meanwhile, but he had the same thirst, so he would ask all these questions. He was walking once in the street and he saw one of the biggest rabbis, Rabbi Nechunya, and Rabbi Nechunya was an older gentleman. So he goes over to the rabbi and says, Rabbi, how did you merit to live such an old age? The servants that were near the rabbi thought, well, the chutzpan. This guy, look at him, guys. So audacity that you have to speak to a rabbi like that. So they started chasing him. So he runs up a tree. And while he's running up the tree, he asks another question. He was so search for knowledge and didn't stop. He's like, Rabbi, he says, why does it say keves echad? Keves is singular. Echad is also singular. Why do we need the double lashon? So Rabbi Nechunya sees that he's really just asking questions to learn. So he tells the servant, he says, no, leave him down, come down. He says, I see that his really thirst is to learn. He says, come down and I'll answer your questions. So he says, first of all, keves echad. It says the reason why it says keves, which is singular, and echad also that's singular, is because to show you that not only you take one sheep, you take the best of the sheep. Additionally, you want to know why I lived such a long life? He says he gave him a few reasons. First of all, I never accepted any gifts. It says, somebody who hates gifts will live. So not only that, I never took revenge for any bad that was done to me. Also, I forgave people for any harm they caused me, just like I forgave them, God forgave my sins. And additionally, any riches that God gave me, I gave benefit to others. So that's why I was benefit for the long life. And this is how Rabbi Akiva went, and he continued asking questions, things like that. But in yeshiva and his students, he was very in front of his rabbis. He was very, just soaking in all the knowledge. Meanwhile, almost 12 years go by, and he's sitting there in front of the rabbis, and they have this this sort of a disagreement. They're not sure. They're arguing back and forth. The big rabbis, what is the law? The problem that came was what happens when Pesach, you're supposed to give a Korban Pesach on Erev Pesach. So what happens if Erev Pesach falls on Shabbat? Are you able to put the Korban Pesach on Shabbat? So they were going back and forth, bringing proofs back and forth here and there. And meanwhile, Akiva stands up and he says something, but he says it with such clarity and brings so many proofs. Like everyone turns around and be like, what? Like, who is this guy? Like, how, you get lost in a big yeshiva. All of a sudden, Akiva shows what all the knowledge that he has. And from that moment on, it wasn't just like, Akiva sitting down by the stairs. It was like, okay, everybody knew that, this guy knows his stuff. And not only that, when somebody went and had any question on mathematics, on medicine, on astrology, and any other science, they went and they asked Akiva, because he was the guy who just learned from everything. And he would answer them. And then after he finishes answering, he goes right back, sits down by his teacher's feet, and continues to learn Torah. So, for 12 years pass by, and suddenly the time comes for him to, and we'll finish in a few minutes, the time comes for him to go and return. He says, his wife says 12 years, time to go and return for home. So, meanwhile, there was a certain troublemaker living in the town of where Rachel lived, and she goes and this troublemaker goes and tells her, he says, listen, you're such a fool. Not only you gave up riches, you also gave up your husband. It says 12 years he's gone. He forgot about you already. Who knows where he is by now? He's gone. He says, what are you thinking about, doing all this? And she says, no. He says, listen, I hear some reports. I hear he's doing really well. He says, I'm very happy that I sent him. And besides, she tells him, says, listen, the time is coming that he's supposed to be coming back anyways it's 12 years. So this troublemaker always used to sit at the beginning, at the entrance of the town. One of the reasons is, I don't know if we'll get to it, he was also unknown to anybody right now. He was also a spy. So for the Roman government, so he was, he acted like this, and that's why so whatever. So in any case, for a different time, maybe I don't know if we'll speak about it possibly in the last class. But anyways, so he goes, and he realizes now Akiva's coming. This is like a troublemaker guy, very loud guy. He says, okay, let's, he starts on the lookout for Akiva. And they go, as I know, suddenly he sees a tall man, bald guy walking into town. And he says, that's Akiva. He says, I recognize it, a tall guy, you miss him. And so what he does, this troublemaker goes, he runs in front of Akiva, and he goes over to Rachel, and he tells her, he says, you see, 12 years have come, he's not coming. He starts bad-mouthing Akiva in front of her. He says, listen, you left everything, look what you could have done, you could have had the riches. And meanwhile, Akiva is getting close to the house, and he overhears this conversation between the two people, his wife and this complainer. So some say that it was a woman, but whatever it was somebody complaining to Rachel. And Akiva's listening over there. Rabbi Akiva's listening, and he says, and she says, this guy is leaving you, and he doesn't complaining. Meanwhile, Rachel responds and says, listen, he says, I am so confident that I am so happy that he's doing what he's doing that if he comes back and he hears me, I would say go back for another 12 years. That's how much I wanted to learn Torah. Rabbi Akiva was sitting outside. He heard this. He turned around and he went right back to learn Torah. Didn't even come into the house. He went right back and he learned Torah. So he goes and he leaves and he goes back for Torah for another 12 years. After all, this is his wife's wishes. Meanwhile, 12 years go by, and he decides that now it's time for him to come back again, and so he goes and he starts making his way back into his hometown. And this time, though, it's 24 years passed since he left home, and now he started becoming very well known in the Jewish world. Like everybody heard about Rabbi Akiva. Now he was already, not only was a rabbi, he was a rabbi of 24,000 students. Think about who has that many students. That's how big he became in the 24 years. So he says, listen, he goes to the students, says, listen, I have to make my way back. I promised my wife 24 years. Now I have to go make my way back. So what do the students do? You go where your rabbi goes, because he teaches Torah everywhere. He went with an entourage of 24,000 students making their way back into their hometown. And they're going over there. Meanwhile, everybody's hearing. They see a bunch of students coming. And they're like, everyone's asking questions. What's going on here? They're like, oh no, the biggest rabbi in Israel, one of the biggest rabbis in Israel is coming to visit over here. He's coming to. So everyone started coming out and they're greeting him. It's tremendous, the scene, if you could only imagine what's going on. And meanwhile, Rachel hears about this. She's so excited, so happy. And she runs out and she goes and she sees this big entourage. And she sees, in the center, all in the center is Akiva, her husband. And she starts making her way into it. Meanwhile, The students go and they see this old, poor beggar woman rushing and trying to see the rabbi. They're like, oh, they try to, hold her back. They say, listen, it's a big rabbi. You can't just push yourself all into it. Rabbi Akiva saw her and he says, no. And he made like, Kriyat Yam Suf. He's like, you make sure she comes up to the front right away. And she comes up to him and he announces to all the students. And he says to her, he says, all my Torah and all your Torah is all hers. If not for her, none of this would have happened. And he goes in and explains that, it's only because of her. And they had a very emotional reunion. And meanwhile, her father, Kalva Savua, was, heard about this big rabbi coming into, nearby to his town. So he decided to, bothered him, about the vow that he made to his daughter. throughout the years, his daughter Rachel tried to make up with her father. Sent in and says, "Please, forgive me. Please, what I did. I really felt I needed to." And and Kavaswell was hard on his ground. Did not. He rejected everything. Now he was getting older. He started feeling bad. So he wanted to speak to this rabbi. He didn't know that this rabbi was his son-in-law. He wanted to speak to this rabbi to annul his vow. So he goes over to this rabbi, and he says, "Listen." He says, "Rabbi, the richest guy comes into town, and when he walks in, there's another Kriyat Yam Suf from the other end, right? And he was walking right back in there. So he walks right into the front, and he says, and he's looking at Rabbi Akiva, but he doesn't recognize that he was a servant, many years ago. And he says, Rabbi, I need your advice. I have an issue at hand. I have a daughter, and I vowed to disown her. And I held by the vow. But now I'm getting older, and I feel like, I made a mistake. I'm growing lonely, and I want to annul that vow. So Rabbi Akiva says, explain to me the situation. So he says, she went and she married this ignorant, poor shepherd, and I vowed that she wouldn't touch a penny of my money. So he says, Rabbi Akiva goes and says, and had this poor, ignorant shepherd, had he become, learned Torah, he says, you would have made the vow as well. And the Ben Kabbalah answered, he says, listen, to be honest with you, the fact that he didn't have money didn't bother me so much. What really bothered me was the fact that he was so ignorant. He knew nothing about the Torah, nothing about Yiddishkeit, nothing about Judaism. He says, why should you have to go and marry this guy? If I would have known that even if he would have learned a little bit, known one Mishnah, known one halacha, I would have already not made the vow. So the Rabbi Akiva goes over to him and he says, my dear father, it is I, Akiva ben Yosef. I am your son-in-law. And your daughter, Rachel, she's my beloved wife. And Bekavaswa sees this. He starts crying. He starts weeping. He says, "Can you forgive me, Rabbi?" And Rabbi Akiva was like, "No. What you did was justified." He says, "There's no reason to forgive." But he says, "I could annul your vow very simply because had you known now what you would have known back then, you would have made the vow. So the vow is annulled." So he went and he called over, the Rachel and his wife and Makabas was his daughter. It was just such an emotional connection, emotional meeting that they had with tears in both of their eyes. And the father goes over to her and he says, please, you were able to foresee the future so much better than I have, and please forgive me, my dear daughter, for causing you so much anguish and pain. What did Rachel answer back? Years she was in poverty. She couldn't have any money. She had to struggle to survive. She could have said, "No, I would have made my life a lot easier." No complaint. Nothing came out of her mouth like that. Do you know what she replied? She says, "Oh, no, father. The suffering? Chas v'shalom. How could I suffer anguish? I married the wisest, most noble man in the world." He said, "Suffering? I had the most unbelievable time. I had the most unbelievable marriage. I'm as fortunate and happy as any woman can be. Baruch Hashem that I married a tzaddik." He says, "The only thing I was missing is your fatherly love." Ben Kavaswell was so moved by this. He goes at that moment in time and he tells Akiva, he says, half my wealth is yours right now. I'm signing off half my wealth to you. And the other half will be after I pass away, is also going to you. That's how fortunate it was. Rabbi Akiva started, and we're going to soon see, but Zad Hashem will probably speak about it next class also, and how he came from the ignorant, illiterate, poor shepherd to one of the wealthiest people. And there's 6 ways that he made money that he made tremendous amount of money, which we'll go, Zad Hashem, speak through all of it. But in any case, I want to finish with one last story on Akiva, and we'll close it off with this. There was a time coming for Akiva's daughter to get married, and she got it. While it was time for her to get married, they told her, the astrologist told Akiva when she was born, says this daughter, she's going to die on her wedding day. Akiva still said, listen, we got to do what we got to do, and she still needs to get married because it's an obligation to get married. And he goes and he starts making arrangements for he's the biggest rabbi in the world. He can really get the biggest tzaddik in the world as well. So she goes and he starts, speaking about, potential matches for his daughter. And he goes over to her and he says, I have a potential match. So the daughter, goes over to her father and says, Father, I hope you're not going to be angry with me, but I have a confession to make with you. When we were younger, there was one boy that stood out, and I told this boy, says, if you go learn Torah, then I will promise you I will marry you. So the father started laughing and started smiling. He says, you're just exactly like your mother's daughter. He says, all right, no, listen, if you made this commitment, who is this guy? Who is, maybe I know him. So he says, this guy is Shimon ben Azai. He says, you also have a good eye like your mother. You picked a wise guy. He says, a big Talmid Chacham, Shimon ben Azai. And he says, fine, that's what you did. I agree. And they arranged a wedding and they got married to Shimon ben Azai. On the wedding day, they're celebrating, and Ben Akiva-The wanted, his granddaughter's getting married. It wasn't going to be just a little wedding. He, made a feast for the entire town. Everybody came to this wedding. It's a huge wedding. Meanwhile, there was one poor beggar that came in, dressed in rags, and nobody was paying attention. Everyone's running back and forth. The servants are going back and forth, and the one person that saw this poor person was the kala, the bride. And she goes over and she rushes over to him and says, no, can I help you? And says, I'm starving, whatever, I need some food. And she goes and says, not only that, she went and she clothed him so he'll be clothed properly for the feast. And she went and she made sure that she had that she gave him some food to eat. And she says, please, come stay for the entire duration of the feast of the wedding. Meanwhile, she's at the wedding, and she had a golden pin on her hair that was sort of bothering her. So she took out this golden pin without looking, there's a wall behind. She just stuck it in the wall, figuring out, I'll pick it up later. And not thinking about it, she went on with the wedding. The wedding went amazing. Everything was Baruch Hashem very good. And the next day, she goes to retrieve the pin from the wall. And to her surprise, she takes out the pin, and in the pin lays this small but one of the most deadliest snakes. That and she's shocked. She runs to her father and she says, "Look what I found." And so he goes over to her and he says, he remembered, of course, the prophet. It wasn't prophecy. The what the astrologer said, and they said, this snake for sure would have bit you. It was right behind you. You literally just, it was within arm's length. He says, the snake would have sure killed you. He says, what did you do on the wedding night that actually, that it gave you the merit to be saved? So she started thinking, it's like, no, I don't know about the order, anything I'd order. There's a poor guy there. I happened to, give him some charity. And Rabbi Akiva smiled and says, this is what it says, Tzakat tatzil mimavet. Charity saves from death. And here we see the charity that you gave is the reason why you're still alive today. We'll see the unbelievable sacrifices that not only Rabbi Akiva made, but also that his wife, Rachel made. And Bezrat Hashem will continue next week with continuation of this story, this amazing story. But what we have to all understand from this story is that there's only so much time that I have that I can't go and explain each lesson. Every single story, there's a wealth of lessons that can be learned from this story. And it's imperative that we learn from this, especially during the time before Matan Torah, before the time of getting Torah, that we have to make ourselves better people. That we can learn both from Rabbi Akiva for the man and for the woman. We can learn about Rachel. And Bezrat Hashem, may we be able to continue this, and we'll be able to learn the greatness of Rabbi Akiva, and we'll be able to instill that in ourselves and become great as well ourselves.